So the new iPads dropped a couple of weeks ago. I've put out my initial reviews and I've been getting a lot of questions about which iPad to get. Hey, I'm a student, which iPad should I get? Or hey, I use my iPad mainly for content consumption and productivity, which iPad Pro is right for me? Well, if you ask me, the right iPad Pro for most people is the iPad Air. Let's ramble.
Hold up, place go wild when I pull up. They all on me like it once.
The iPad Air has always been a really solid alternative to the iPad Pro for most people, but now it seems that the lines between the iPad Air and the iPad Pro have become even thinner, with features that used to be exclusive to the iPad Pro lineup now appearing on the new M2 iPad Air as well. The box is just as empty as the one on the M4 iPad Pro, or at least here in Europe. No charging brick, just the actual iPad and a braided cable. Personally, I'm not too salty about that. I have plenty of chargers laying around and I see the point of trying to avoid producing e-waste, but not everybody's swimming in chargers, and at the prices Apple is charging, we should be able to get a charger included. Maybe they should make that an option at checkout. Anyway, the design remains largely unchanged, with a marginally larger screen that comes in at 11 inches as opposed to 10.9 inches on the previous model. It's still got that sleek and minimal look. I got the blue colorway to change things up a bit from the space gray and space black I usually go for, but the blue is a bit more subdued, a bit less vibrant than it was on the previous model. It still has that power button on top, volume rockers on the right side, 4 speaker grills, of which only 2 are populated with actual speakers, but we'll get back to that later. And a USB-C port, not a Thunderbolt port, we will talk about that some more later as well, and it still has that generous 10-hour battery life. Now, just like on the previous models, the power button doubles as a fingerprint scanner, and unfortunately, that is still the only form of biometric authentication, no Face ID, only Touch ID on the M2 iPad Air as well. Some nice improvements though in connectivity. The new iPad Air has Bluetooth 5.3 instead of Bluetooth 5.0 on the previous model, and it went up from Wi-Fi 6 to Wi-Fi 6E. The most notable change has got to be the position of the front-facing camera, which just like the M4 Pro iPads has finally moved to the landscape orientation where it belongs. Hallelujah. Now, speaking of the camera system, this is the exact same as we see on the M4 iPad Pros. A 12 megapixel wide camera on the back and a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera on the front. The only difference is that the iPad Pro can shoot 4K videos in ProRes, whereas the iPad Air shoots in regular 4K. Now, personally, I've used my iPads to shoot videos exactly 0 times in my life. The only reason I ever use the camera is to scan a document, and for that it works totally fine. It does not, however, have this new feature that eliminates the shadows from the documents. That's only on the M4 iPad Pro, and I have to admit that is a pretty useful feature to have. We all know how difficult it can be to avoid shadows when scanning documents, so yeah, that's something to keep in mind if that's a feature you do use a lot. What is not the same is the microphone array. The iPad Air has 2 microphones, while the iPad Pro has 4 of what Apple calls studio quality microphones, and that difference is audible. Okay, so now you're looking at the camera on the iPad Pro and listening to the audio of the iPad Pro. And now you're looking at the camera of the M2 iPad Air and listening to the audio of the M2 iPad Air. Likewise, you will definitely notice a difference in audio quality, and that is mainly because the iPad Pro has 4 speakers, whereas the iPad Air has only 2 on opposite corners. They both have 4 speaker grills, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, only 2 of them are populated.
They'll be my treasures forever. When I can't hold you tight, I'll see the Stockholm lights. The Stockholm lights, the Stockholm lights.
Now, what's kind of weird now, I guess, is that the iPad Pro has become thinner and lighter than the iPad Air, so the naming convention doesn't make too much sense anymore. You know, with the iPad Pro being airier than the iPad Air, I guess you could argue that it's a bit lighter on the specs. One of the biggest, or at least most noticeable differences between the M2 Air and the M4 Pro will be the display. The iPad Air still has that same liquid retina display, and don't get me wrong, it's a very nice display. I mean, for an LCD panel, it really does have great color accuracy, but of course it does not compare to the new OLED display on the Pro models, or as Apple calls it, Ultra Retina XDR display. And it's not just the quality of the display, but also the snappiness and the brightness. While the iPad Air caps out at 500 nits, the M4 iPad Pro has a max brightness of 1000 nits all the way up to 1600 nits in HDR mode. And if you tend to use your iPad outside a lot or in very bright environments, that difference could be meaningful. The iPad Air did get a bunch of features that were previously only available on the Pro models, but unfortunately 120Hz ProMotion is not one of them, which means that the Air is still stuck at 60Hz refresh rate. It doesn't really matter for static stuff or browsing or reading, something like that, but you will notice it for things like gaming, especially in games like PUBG, where you can go all the way up to 120Hz in performance mode on the Pro iPads. The Air also doesn't have hardware accelerated ray tracing, so yeah, on those very demanding console type games, the difference can be visible and you might experience a tiny bit of lag every now and then, but I doubt most people will really notice in everyday use. Like the iPad Pro, you can hook up the iPad Air to an external monitor, and since that's capped at 60Hz anyway, it will look pretty much the same on both tablets. One thing to keep in mind though is that the USB-C port on the iPad Air is not a Thunderbolt port and it's capped at 10 gigabits per second, whereas the Thunderbolt port on the M4 iPad Pro goes up to 40 gigabits per second, which you will notice when you hook up a dongle and start connecting peripherals to the iPad. You know, if you want to use it with an external monitor, for instance, and you want to hook up some other stuff as well, you will start noticing it getting slower. With that said, I personally really don't use my iPads with an external display. It still feels pretty clunky to me, and there's just too many bugs and little annoyances that put me off from using it. Of course, there will also be a noticeable difference in transfer speeds, which can be important if you use your iPad for things like video editing. But if you are the type of user who relies heavily on that kind of stuff, chances are you already know very well which iPad you need. Now, one of the main selling points of this iPad Air is that most of the older accessories will still fit, and that includes the previous 11-inch Magic Keyboard. The iPad Pro, on the other hand, will not fit the previous Magic Keyboard and requires the new Magic Keyboard. Now, I'm sure some people would have liked the iPad Air to fit the new Magic Keyboard, but most users that are looking into the iPad Air are doing so because they're looking to save some cash, and they really aren't interested in paying several hundreds of dollars again to buy another Magic Keyboard. The only thing that won't work with the M2 iPad Air is the 2nd gen Apple Pencil. Now that does suck a little bit from a cost perspective if you already own the 2nd gen Apple Pencil, since you will need to invest into an Apple Pencil Pro if you want to keep using the Pencil. But if you're an artist, the fact that the Air is compatible with the Apple Pencil Pro is actually great news, because now you get to enjoy all those new features like the squeeze function, like the barrel roll, which have been welcomed very much by the artist community without having to invest into a more expensive iPad Pro. And because the Air now has the M2 chip inside, it will also support Pencil Hover, which again is a very useful feature for artists. And of course, the Apple Pencil Pro comes equipped with Find My, which is a really useful addition for scatterbrains like yours truly. So in many ways, the iPad Air is very similar to the M2 iPad Pro, especially the 11-inch version, but with the added benefit of that repositioned front-facing camera and the ability to use the new Apple Pencil Pro. The base storage on the iPad Air starts at 128 gigabytes now, which is up from 64, and it goes all the way up to 1 terabyte. But personally, I do believe that 256 should really be the minimum in 2024, but I suppose that would drive the entry-level price up a bit, and it is nice for some non-power users to have that lower end and more budget-friendly option available. Now, if we compare prices between the Air and the Pro at that 256 gigabytes option, which is the base storage for the M4 iPad Pro, the Pros come in at $999 and the Air will be $300 cheaper at $699. And if you're fine with 128 gigs, you can get the Air for $599, which is $400 cheaper than the cheapest Pro model. And that is a very significant difference considering you're getting the M2 chip, the repositioned camera, and the ability to use the new Apple Pencil Pro. The thing is, the iPad Pros keep getting more and more powerful, but as it stands, iPadOS is still pretty limiting and it's not making full use of all that extra power. Now, at the time of recording, we are still waiting for WWDC in 2024 to happen, and so my observations here might be due for revision soon. But based on past experiences where we were waiting for DubDub, full of anticipation about significant changes to iPadOS, just to be left disappointed, I'm not keeping my hopes up. Now, if you really need that extra horsepower on the M4 iPad Pro, you already know this anyway. Or maybe you really want that nano texture option that isn't available on the Air. By the way, if you're one of those people who would benefit from the nano texture display, do let me know in the comments below. I'm actually really interested why you would choose that option. Or maybe you just want the best of the best, you want that shiny new iPad Pro and you have the cash to burn. You do you. The iPad Pro is a fantastic piece of tech, but for everybody else that's just looking for the best bang for buck option, this is the one you want. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please get one of these. It really helps the channel. Subscribe for more content. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned for some links to videos you might also want to watch.